go forward with the evening. So we're going to start by having Pamela Berry, who's with the Camden Conference, talk a little bit about their program this year.
Hi, my name is Pamela Berry, and I, on behalf of the Camden Conference, would like to welcome you and thank you for being here tonight and your participation. I'd also very much like to thank Andrea and the Falmouth Library for their work on the presentations and programs we've had. It makes a big difference to us to have community involvement. The goal of the Camden Conference is to foster informed discussion on worldwide issues. And it really is dependent on community events to get the word out, to answer some questions, to get some knowledge out. In 2 weeks, on February 25th through the 27th, the Camden Conference will hold their 35th conference. It will present on Europe, challenged at home and abroad. Information on purchasing tickets is on the Camden Conference website, camdenconference.org. And on this website, you'll see a roster of the speakers and details of our community work. So again, I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight and to thank our presenter. And I'm looking forward to a very interesting program. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just go ahead and switch off. Okay, so I would love to, firstly, my name is Andrea Casalonis, and I am the Adult Services Librarian at Falmouth Memorial Library. I would like to introduce our speaker for the evening, Professor Kenneth Halas, and I would like to tell you a little bit about him. So I'm going to have to refer to my notes because he has a very extensive background. So Ken worked. Ken worked for the State Department as a senior foreign service officer until 2013. Since then, he's been teaching at UMaine's Graduate School of Policy and International Affairs. He continues to work intermittently as a senior inspector in the State Department's Office of the Inspector General, where he was the coordinator for political and economic inspectors. He has served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Warsaw and at the U.S. Embassy in Prague. He led a 40-person interagency provincial reconstruction team in the South Central Iraqi province of Babel. Ken has extensive experience in international conflict resolution and is the recipient of several Superior Honor and Meritorious Honor Awards during assignments in Washington, Moscow, Rome, Pretoria, and Warsaw. He speaks Italian, Spanish, Russian, and Polish and Portuguese. So again, a really storied career. So please, everyone, help me welcome Kenneth Halas.
All right. Thank you, Andrea. I've been asked to talk about the effects of Brexit on Europe. My remarks will be on that. There are a lot of different things to talk about on Europe, but I think for our purposes, it's good to have it be somewhat focused. So it's sort of a brief summary, and then I'll go into it a little bit more, but my intention is to talk no more than 20 minutes, and to then we can open it up after that to questions and answers. So 2 years, it's been 2 years now since Brexit took effect, and the repercussions are still playing out. The political and economic effects have probably been more acutely felt in Britain than in the European Union, but there have been effects, and we'll get to that. In Britain, of course, there's Brexit has rejuvenated the push for independence in Scotland. It recently, the results of the terms of Brexit brought about sort of political crisis in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, where the first and second ministers of the province resigned over questions of custom checks between Northern Ireland and Britain proper. For the EU, the biggest question about Brexit was whether the referendum result would serve as a deterrent or as a catalyst for other states to withdraw from the Union. And so far, Brexit has not really catalyzed other national efforts to organize referenda on withdrawal. 2 years may be a bit early to draw definitive conclusions, but there are no signs of, Brexit redux in other EU member states. EU has now lost, though, the country with the largest number of opt-outs. So for those countries that joined that were EU members before 1992, there are a lot, they could opt out to some of the terms that came out of the Maastricht Agreement, one of a series of EU agreements that have built up the EU into the institution it is today. So the Brits had the most opt-outs. And so with Britain's departure, the EU has become more uniform in terms of its laws and regulations. I'll get into that more if you'd like. Brexit has deprived the EU of one of only 3 military powers capable of deploying major combat forces overseas. The other 2 being France, and you'd probably be surprised to know, Poland. Other EU countries don't have that capability, not at the level of a whole division. It also removes a voice in the EU's internal decision-making that strongly favored close transatlantic security ties. And it's helped sustain EU interest in achieving as Emmanuel Macron calls it, greater strategic sovereignty. I guess in a very broad sense too, the EU loses its most global, as if you did looked at any of the readings there, Nick Burns called the UK the EU's most globally sophisticated member state, and that Brexit diminishes the EU and detracts from its effectiveness in world affairs. Though at this point, it's kind of hard to point at any direct evidence of that. I think it's more perspective. For instance, on EU policy towards China might be one area that is worth looking at going forward. So to see how the EU is managing that whole question. And there's been some changes just in this last year. So on the question of whether Brexit was a deterrent or a catalyst, there has been some research into this question that shows that the more negative the perceived economic impact of Brexit on the UK, the more likely Brexit will serve as a deterrent. Now, like the European economies as well, the UK has not done that well in 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic. But the forecast going forward is actually fairly good. The OECD projects a growth rate, and actually the number is probably, and I think it's 6.9% for 2021, with growth moderating in 2022 to 4.7. Still, that's almost sure to be above the EU average. So Britain doesn't look from a perspective of EU member states as having had that Brexit has had a significant negative impact on the UK. I guess the other thing to keep in mind too is that Brexit is still sort of a contested fact. The UK and EU were able to negotiate a post-Brexit terms on trade, finance, and border controls, the so-called UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement that went into effect January 1 of 2021. But parts of that agreement remain controversial, and the UK government says it wants to specifically revise the agreement on customs that left a soft border between Northern Ireland and Ireland itself, which was one of the provisions of the Good Friday agreements in 1998 that ended the conflict in Northern Ireland and allowed the British to withdraw their army after 1998. There are some minor disagreements, fishing. There's some disputes about French fishing companies not getting licenses that they used to operate in UK waters, and occasionally it's spilled over, and there's been a lot of heated language, but it's a relatively minor point that doesn't concern the EU as a whole. But areas left out of the trade and cooperation agreement between the UK and the EU are just as notable. So it does not cover foreign policy, doesn't cover external security, and it doesn't cover defense cooperation. So there's no framework in place for the UK and the EU to develop and coordinate joint responses to foreign policy challenges. It all has to be done ad hoc. It's not to say that it can't be, and hasn't been actually during the Ukraine crisis over the last couple of months. It also notably did not cover equivalences for financial services, UK data protection regime, and how it fits in with the EU. So lastly, questions of the UK sanitary and phytosanitary regime, which for purposes of listing it as a third country allowed to export food products to the EU. So there are some notable things that weren't covered. So now on the question, on the Irish question, what Brexit has done is put the EU sort of on the front lines of the Irish question. The Johnson government's desire to end the Irish sea customs checks between Northern Ireland and the UK puts the EU on the spot as how to maintain the single market, which includes Ireland, of course, which is an EU member. The EU has supported Ireland in opposing the establishment of a hard border between Ireland and North Ireland. President Biden, in fact, has cautioned the UK government about not undermining the Good Friday Agreement by imposing a hard border. But that may be just the start of the EU's involvement in the intra-Irish question, especially if a majority of Northern Ireland voters endorse unification with Ireland, which for the first time is now actually being talked about as a reality. Sinn Féin may in fact win the spring elections in Northern Ireland for their local, their regional parliament, and they'd be expected to make good on their campaign promises on reunification. So as I mentioned before about opt-out, so Britain's departure reduces the number of EU states that have opt-outs, and the UK was the one that had the most, which were 4 different opt-outs on. Some of them were partial opt-outs. So partial opt-out was Schengen. Full opt-outs were the European Monetary Union and the exchange rate mechanism. The full opt-out on the Charter of Fundamental Rights, and a partial opt-out on what's called the Freedom, Security, and Justice Affairs pillar which is a body of law and regulations that that govern EU in those areas. Only Denmark, Ireland, and Poland now have any opt-outs, and all less than the number that Britain had. Ireland only has 2, and Poland only has 1. Denmark 3. And one of the other effects on the EU, of course, is that with the second biggest economy, the EU has lost one of its the larger parts of its economy and a major net contributor to EU budget revenue. And that's going to require the Commission, EU Commission, they're going to have to be mindful about, how they fund ongoing programs and taking up any additional programs that the things that take the biggest bite out are typically the common agricultural policy, and then the policy for trying to bring up standards of living in some of the newer and less developed EU states, Bulgaria and Romania being big examples. Brexit also took a big bite out of what's called the European Economic Area. So I know you all think of the EU as the part where there's free movement of people's goods, services, and finances, but it's actually bigger than the EU itself, because there's another entity in, not all European states are, first of all, are members of the EU. Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland. So the Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway belong to what was referred to as the European Free Trade Association. And it has a bilateral agreement with the EU that allows its citizens to move around freely in Europe, and Switzerland has just a bilateral deal with the European Union. So it's the European, free movement of people, goods, services, and finances is actually greater than just among EU member states. It includes these other 4 that I mentioned. John, yeah. Was there a question, or I'm just about done here? How are we doing on time? Yeah, 6:20. Yeah, so I'll be wrapping this up shortly. So the Johnson government rejected sort of joining the European Free Trade Agreement area and getting the benefits of free movement of goods, services, people, and finances, in part because the Brexit vote was so contentious, and it would have, Johnson government, and for that matter, Theresa May's conservative government before his, viewed it as politically problematic, that they'd be seen as betraying the results of the Brexit referendum. So there are other things we can talk about a little bit that where Brexit isn't the major thing impact on the EU, but one of those is immigration, which was, by all polling, the main driver of British voters that voted for Brexit. But let me stop there, because I said I'd stop at about 20 minutes, and I think we've gotten to that point.
Hi, Ken, Andrea here. So I'll monitor Q&A, and I just want to remind our attendees that you can type in a question in the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask a question live, go ahead and click the button that says raise hand, and I will unmute you so you can ask that question live. If no one has any immediate questions, I'd like to get us started with one. Ken, could you speak a little bit to the impact on immigration that that Brexit is going to have?
Immigration in the EU, you're talking about the effect on immigration in Europe more broadly. It's so. So you have to put in context, I think, where was Europe in 2016 when the Brexit vote occurred? So the immigration that the Brexit voters were reacting against was not, Syrian refugees, which were maybe nearly half of all the 1.3 million refugees who entered the EU in 2016. It was more about European immigrants from new EU member states, Bulgaria, Romania, the Baltic states, Czech Republic. One of my very good friends in Prague picked up and moved and started working in Derby, UK, as a spinal surgeon. But there was, and UK is an insular country, and all that it was a fairly large wave of immigrants that came into the UK, and so it was just unsettling. It was not a country. London is full of immigrants, but all these other immigrants were all in parts of the UK that were more provincial and hadn't traditionally had large foreign-born populations. But anyway, in Europe, there was going on the Hungarians put up barbed wire on the border with Serbia because many of these immigrants were coming up through the Balkans, looking to get to Germany and France and maybe Scandinavia and other places. So in 2020, for the first time in a while, the EU's population actually dropped. And most people think that it by about 300,000, which, for a country that was, an entity that was 450 million, that's more than 450 million, a little over. That wasn't a huge decline, but it's a drop nonetheless. And the drop was mostly because of a reduced number of immigrants coming into the EU. I mean, birth rates have been low now for quite a while. So it was a lack of immigration. So the EU Commission just the other last year proposed every 6 years they come up with a pact, because the Commission doesn't have the authority to impose regulations on member states concerning. They tried to sort of during the 2016 immigration crisis, and it was resoundingly unsuccessful. That they tried to impose quotas on member states to accept refugees, and a number of the member states said, absolutely no, forget it. Immigration's become a much more divisive issue in the EU over the last 5-6 years, but not because of Brexit. Brexit was a symptom of and had slightly different focus on the immigration problem than, let's say, Mediterranean EU member states have today: Greece, Spain, Italy, or Central, where the opposition to quotas, imposition of quotas for refugees was strongest was in Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania too. The Baltics not quite so much, but it's immigration is sort of a very divisive issue for the Europeans right now, and there. A year after the Commission has proposed a pact on principles that try to balance off solidarity amongst EU member states. And by solidarity, they mean everyone has to take in some of these refugees, and responsibility for EU responsibility for maintaining the security of the European Union's external borders. And they have an agency now for the better part of 10 years called the Frontier Service. It's called Frontex, and it's still fairly small, but they patrol in the Mediterranean and what was probably considered unacceptable by Brussels 6-7 years ago, which is turning people away and sending them back to their countries, has now become much more common and a bit more mainstream. I mean, the Italians, the Greeks, and the Spanish will intercept people at sea and take them back to where they came from. And you didn't see that. Let me put it this way: it was not a common practice more than 6 or 7 years ago. Today, it's more common. I don't know if that answers your question, Andrea.
It does. Thank you. I like having that broader context. And we did have a few questions come in. So let's start with Bonnie's, who asks, what is the impact now on young British people studying in other EU countries or taking jobs in other countries?
Yeah, so it's I can't give you any numbers, but they're pretty much in the same boat that Americans are. They're I'm not 100% sure about whether. So there's a scholarship program called the Erasmus program that the EU does that allows and covers university exchanges within the EU, and allows if you're Dutch, you can go study in Prague or Spain, or I don't believe that the Brits got, under the terms of the Brexit, the economic and cooperation agreement provides for any special status for or place for British students. I could be wrong. It's not my area of expertise. I will admit, education is not, American education maybe a little more, but not for the Brits.
So we also have a question from Pays, who asks, will the EU be able to create/increase the losses of military intelligence and diplomacy that Britain brought to the EU?
That's a very tricky question. Keep in mind that the sharing of sensitive intelligence, the Brits didn't do on a other than an exceptional basis. The only on like intercepted communications, things like this, the very sensitive intelligence is shared amongst the so-called Five Eyes, which are all Anglophone countries, the UK, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and all comes out of cooperation. It's a legacy of World War II, but it's been sustained through the years. And at times there have been discussions about expanding it to include others. Now, for a little bit less sensitive and on a case-by-case basis, yes, the Brits will share with the French, especially if they get intelligence, let's say, about threats against French forces in the African Sahel, or but it's one of the few areas for the EU. Now, there's police intelligence, crime information about, criminal organizations, et cetera, that I wouldn't consider to be national intelligence or strategic intelligence. And that, I'm sure, still gets shared because there are things like Interpol. But intelligence is one of the few areas. So out of all the different councils that, there's European Union Council on Foreign Affairs, on finance, there are at least 17 different councils where ministers get together and eventually can adopt laws. They have to be approved by Parliament too. There is a council on defense. There's none on intelligence. There never has been. It's sort of one of the last. So the EU, you have to think of the EU as a sort of a two-headed entity. It's both a supranational organization or supranational entity, and the Commission has powers that are national laws in areas where the Commission has authority, like on foreign trade. It's national laws are subordinate. So no EU country conducts its own trade, negotiates trade agreements. It's all done by, which is a big disadvantage for the Brits, because for 40 years, they've had no one in their government bureaucracy negotiating trade agreements. So they did not start with a bench. But on intelligence, no, it's not something, sensitive intelligence was not something that they shared. And in fact, the Brits, like the Americans, spied on their own allies. You remember famously the Germans finding out that the US government, or parts of it, this is all in the public domain, so none of this is classified, was listening in on Angela Merkel's cell phone calls. This was 12 years ago. And Barack Obama had just come into, maybe it was a little bit less, 2010, yeah. Barack Obama just came into office and apologized, and we stopped intercepting cell phone calls of Angela Merkel and presumably others as well. It was, but it's not the only, the French spy on their EU, fellow EU member states. I wouldn't say that fellow EU member states are a priority for French intelligence, but there are other priorities for the French that take precedence. But intelligence is still something that isn't, where EU member states don't have a structured cooperation. So, and that's the other part, the dual-headed supranational entity, the Commission, an intergovernmental organization is the European Council, which is the heads of state and government, or the Council of the European Union. I know this all sounds like alphabet soup, but that's ministers, the Council of the European Union. European Council just provides guidance and sets policies. These are heads of state and heads of government, but they've never tried to work out a EU-wide intelligence service or a means for sharing intelligence.
Thank you. We also have a question from Charlotte, who asks, has Brexit affected NATO in any way?
Yeah, I tried to allude to that a little bit in my originally. So Yes, but principally indirectly. I mean, the UK remains a NATO member state. What is missing now, though, is so there's been during most of my career from 1980 up until 2013, there was always somewhat of a tension, especially more in the 90s and onward, as the EU explored different, it's made several stabs at trying to come up with its own military force, even sort of in a very limited kind of way. So you had battle groups in the first decade of this century, a concept, EU battle groups. It never took off. They now have a proposal for a rapid reaction force. And, we're talking about only 5,000 troops, but it wouldn't be for actually engaging in combat anywhere. It's more modest in what it's looking to do. Peacekeeping, trying to secure a certain area, maybe, but not actually going to war on behalf of the European Union. The French always tried to. French have been the ones who've pushed this hardest. They're all the way back in the 1950s. They came up with the idea of a European army, and it was rejected. It never took off. It didn't have support from other EU members. A lot of the European Union member states look at Germany as the dominant economic power, and they look at France as the one that wants to try to sort of lead EU foreign and defense and security policy. So the effect on NATO is, indirectly coming back to your question, is that the EU no longer has this sort of strong transatlantic voice that helps keep the two entities complementary. And they largely have been. But the concern is that as Macron and others, especially after the experience of the Trump administration, Angela Merkel as well talked about it when she was chancellor, the desire for Europe, or for the EU specifically, to have greater strategic autonomy and not rely on the United States as much. And when they say not rely on the United States, that by implication means don't put all their eggs in the NATO basket. There's an underlying tension. It's never made things dysfunctional, in part because 90% of EU members, well, 90%, more than 80% of EU member states are also in NATO. It's only the Austrians, the Irish, the Swedes and the Finns, the Cypriots, the Maltese, and even the Swedes and the Finns during this crisis now. There actually are debates in Swedish and Finnish press and parliaments about maybe they ought to think about joining NATO. So the overlapping membership helps lubricate any sort of tension there is between NATO and the EU. But it's going forward. It's going to not having the UK in the EU will not help in that regard.
Thank you, Ken. We've got another question from Bonnie, who asks, can you address the area of agriculture? Britain has long been dependent on import of agricultural products, not only from former colonies, but also fellow EU countries. Are there shortages of particular food types?
No, there My understanding is there have been some shortages, but I mean, everyone has had, both on the European continent and in North America, supply chain issues have made for shortages and have also contributed to inflationary pressures as well. The transportation is more complicated now because to import things, they have to go through customs checks, whereas before it was, there was none of that. So it slows it down. I don't think there have been serious sustained shortages in foodstuffs. And I don't think that's likely to, the cost of the food, imported foods, because now, there are tariffs on things that come in. So I'd say in general, it's not been a serious problem. I certainly haven't noticed it in the international press reporting on the UK.
And Bonnie followed up with another question. Is there a change with respect to English as a major working language in the EU?
No. It's interesting. There are, you'd be surprised, there are very few senior officials in member state governments that don't have either adequate or proficient command of English. I mean, in the Scandinavian countries, it's like 95% of the population. Finland is. It's always been a surprise to me that a little island could get everyone to speak its tongue in so many different parts of the world. But this was not the case, especially in Central Eastern Europe 50 years ago, or even 30 years ago. But it's changed significantly now. I mean, Foreign Minister of Lithuania speaks almost unaccented English. His grandfather, who was the leader of the Lithuanian independence movement or nationalist movement, in the last years of communism, barely spoke any English, and maybe a handful of words. Landsbergis was the grandfather's name, and the foreign minister now, his grandson, is Landsbergis too. But so it's, younger people have in younger generations in Europe are amazingly skilled in English. Now, that said, Europe recognizes all the major national language groups as having official status. And so if you're good at translating from Finnish into Portuguese, there are lots of, the EU spends a hell of a lot of money on interpreters for meetings where, because sometimes members will, especially the French, prefer to speak in their national language and have it translated because they don't, for questions of pride primarily.
And then we have Pays who asks, how does Brexit help or hurt the interests of the US?
Oh, that's a very good question. And you'd get two very different answers asking the current president and his predecessor, you'd get, who had very different views. Let me say this, with the exception of President Trump, every American president for the last 50 years, I take that back, 60 years, has supported, starting with the European coal and steel community in the very early 50s, European integration. During the Cold War, it was, to get the Europeans, stood up after the devastation of World War II and to be able to contribute to the defense of the continent or the Western Europe in those days. In the last 30 years, it's been as much about, because the US and the EU share a lot of the same values in terms of democracy and human rights, and some of the ways to address transnational challenges, such as climate change. And because we have similar geostrategic interests as well, and similar, I'm not saying identical, the United States always was desirous of a European Union that could act coherently and effectively on the global stage as a partner of the United States. And that worked by and large right up until 2016. And it continued to work, not despite some of the things that President Trump said about the European Union and how the UK should get out. Certainly the US foreign policy establishment was very few thought that Britain gained very much, and saw a lot of potential downsides. The Irish question and Scottish move towards independence, or so if those two things happen, it kind of takes the great out of Great Britain. As you can see, it'd be the United Kingdom of Wales and England, which I certainly hope Queen Elizabeth II doesn't live to see, because, when she came to the throne, the country headed an empire. And it's quite possible that it's going to be a much more diminished political entity if Ireland and Scotland go in Northern Ireland and Scotland go in a different direction.
Thank you for that answer, Ken. It looks like we don't have any remaining questions. I'm going to check our chat boxes, but if you'd like to get in a question, make sure to go ahead and send that in now. And if you have a question that comes to you later, by all means, you can reach out to the library and I can connect you to Ken to get that question answered. Email here is reference@falmouthmemoriallibrary.org. It's where most of you would have gotten your registration information from. All right, well,
thank you, Andrea and Pamelia, and for everyone who joined in. I hope you get to, I think this is going to be one of the better Camden conferences that they've had. It's a great lineup, and they certainly have a big waterfront of topics to cover, much more than what we have here. Anyway,
excellent.
I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Ken. And we hope to see you all at the Camden conference. Take care, everyone. Stay warm.
Bye-bye.